It's a wondrous, wintry mix wonderland, and this is your Daily Detroit, recorded on Wednesday, February 20th, 2019. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. There's big news today that Cobo Center will be renamed. On today's show, I speak with historian and journalist Ken Coleman. He'll share some important background around today's announcement. That and more after a quick word from a sponsor. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Bamboo Detroit. With an inclusive community, flexible modern offices, classes, and networking events, Bamboo Detroit helps entrepreneurs and innovative companies launch, land, or expand in Detroit. Become one of more than 400 members today at bamboodetroit.com.
The big story in Detroit today, as we said, has to do with the city's longtime convention hall. Cobo Center will be getting a new name. The authority that operates Cobo has awarded naming rights to Chemical Bank for $1.5 million a year over 22 years. Chemical is currently proposing to merge with Minnesota-based TCF Bank, and it's building a 20-story headquarters in downtown Detroit. The new name for Cobo won't be announced until the merger's fate is determined. Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has for years been saying that the convention center should be renamed. It's currently named for former Mayor Albert Cobo, who served from 1950 to 1957. Here's Duggan at today's news conference.
The Cobo era was marked by the wiping out of African-American neighborhoods in the name of urban renewal. It was an era that displaced African-American families in a way that was discriminatory and callous. And the tensions from those eras still reverberate in the city of Detroit today. And I didn't believe that our civic center should, in its name, be celebrating that era, that we should be celebrating the future.
Duggan also noted that Chemical Bank Chairman Gary Torgo led an effort to raise $35 million in corporate donations to feed the city's Strategic Neighborhood Fund. That's the fund to redevelop neighborhood commercial districts throughout the city.
The Cobo story is interesting, and it shines a light on the divides that have plagued us as a region. It's worth a deep dive. To do just that, I spoke with Detroit-based historian and journalist Ken Coleman. Much of his work focuses on African-American life in Detroit. Ken, what's the story behind Mayor Albert Cobo? Why did he get a convention center named after him, and why are there so many questions about his legacy today?
Mayor Cobo certainly deserves a ton of credit for remaking, in a positive sense, remaking downtown Detroit as we know it. Bringing in the Civic Center with landmarks that we recognize today. And they would be the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center, formerly known as the City County Building. That opened in 1953 or 1954 during Mayor Cobo's tenure. The Veterans Administration Building on the city's riverfront certainly opened during that time. And, of course, the Convention Center. Certainly, Mayor Cobo got the ball rolling on that, and it was his vision, and that's why even after he passed away in 1957, the Convention Center was named in his honor, and it opened in 1960. So there's no question that Mayor Cobo deserves lots of credit in that regard. On the other hand, he also raised through eminent domain in the name of urban renewal, he wiped out an historic neighborhood on the city's Lower East Side, which by the time 1950 had come and he'd been sworn in as mayor, was really the oldest African-American community in the city. And one that had a great deal of historic nature, not only for African Americans, but for European immigrants for probably 100 years. The Black Bottom neighborhood really was one of the first neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. In the 1800s, it had been largely farmland. By first the French settlers and then European immigrants, but by the 1920s and 30s became exclusively an African-American community. And while Mayor Cobo was not the first Detroit mayor to call for the raising of Black Bottom, that was actually Mayor Edward Jeffries Jr. in 1946. While Cobo didn't start the idea, he clearly carried it out, and it led to the displacement of hundreds of African Americans within the city.
How do you think awareness of Mayor Cobo's history came to the fore? I don't remember these kinds of conversations 20 years ago.
Well, I think a lot of it is, and people have asked me this question, and people who study and do the research of Detroit, particularly African American community in Detroit, have talked about this a lot in the last couple of years. I really think there's been more of an interest in Mayor Cobo's tenure, namely because there's been a resurgence and an interest in the community known as Black Bottom in the last several years. There have been books written about Black Bottom. There have been theatrical productions and a really sort of resurgence in concentration on Detroit's history, or at least contemporary history. And I think a lot of that discussion about Black Bottom and that community and where it was and why did it leave. A lot of that conversation over the last several years have caused people to peel back the onion, if you will, and then better understand the mayoral tenures of people like Edward Jeffries and Mayor Albert Cobo and Mayor Louis Mariani, three gentlemen who during various times in the history of Black Bottom really carried out efforts to bring about its demise. And so I think the conversation that we've been having the last couple of years about whether or not the convention center should be renamed, a lot of that has come about because more people have done a deep dive into what happened to Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. And in a very real sense, Mayor Albert Cobo presided over the demise of both those communities.
And as a student of history, albeit amateur, one of the things I noticed too is there's this conversation that, corruption in Detroit was a newer thing. You know, you think about Coleman, Young, and later, but that's not the case at all. I mean, Detroit had a litany of corrupt politicians and officials going back throughout its history.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Former Mayor Richard Reading went to state prison. He was convicted after his mayoralty, but only a couple of years after, and in the early 1940s served time in prison in connection with a numbers running racket. And so that's Richard Reading in the 1940s. Mayor Mariani served as mayor after Mayor Cobo from 1957 to 1961. But what federal authorities learned in the 1960s, when Mayor Mariani had left the mayoralty and had gone on to become a city council member, what federal authorities learned is that Mayor Mariani, during his term as mayor, evaded taxes. And Mariani went to jail for almost a year in the late 1960s after being convicted of tax evasion. And so certainly contemporary history shows us, and we all know of the Kwame Kilpatrick, the Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick situation, but former mayors in Detroit have gone to jail too, and the others are white, and the time frame goes back as far as 70 years.
One of the questions that stunned me as a city resident, it was from a family member sending me this article about this Cobo news. His comment with the link was, "So when are we going to rename everything that's been named after Coleman Young in the city?" So can you give me some context around why that argument might or might not make sense?
Yeah, look, I'm an African American and a lifelong Detroit resident, and somebody who recognizes that elected officials, if you serve more than a day or two, you're going to do some things right, and you're going to get some things wrong. You're not going to get everything right. I would certainly not compare in this context. I certainly would not compare Mayor Cobo and Mayor Mariani and Mayor Reading and Mayor Jeffries to Coleman Young in the context of the subject matter we're talking about. In the case of Cobo, never convicted of anything formally, but the devastation that he caused to a community, a growing community in Detroit, is very well documented and pronounced. In 1954, a federal district court judge ruled that Mayor Cobo's housing department, or housing commission, practiced racial discrimination in its policies and practices. That was a federal court judge. I don't know of any situation, although there were subordinates of Mayor Coleman Young who were tried in court, at least one convicted and served time. I don't know of any situation where a federal judge ruled that Coleman Young, for example, or a department of his, had carried out race discrimination or carried out something as egregious as race discrimination. I think that Coleman Young obviously is a colorful individual and one that engenders very violent, sometimes reactions from people and positions from people. I think a lot of that had to do with just the way he talked, as opposed to his policy itself. But reasonable people can disagree. I would certainly argue, though, that Mayor Cobo, on balance, is one of the worst mayors the city of Detroit has had. And you don't have to take my word for it. All you have to do is go back to a very thoughtful Detroit Free Press feature of several years ago. And interestingly enough, in that feature, not only did they call Mayor Albert Cobo one of the worst mayors in Detroit's history, it actually referred to Mayor Coleman Young as among one of the best.
Well, and Coleman Young actually got a lot of projects done, some of them controversial, no doubt, like the Pulltown plant, but there were others throughout the city that there were a lot of cards that were dealt to him that he had no control over. And not, again, as you said brilliantly about politicians, and there's some things that are good and some things that are bad. It's one of those things of there were a lot of cards dealt to urban areas across the nation that were not great. He was playing with a very difficult hand. And the other thing I'd add is I think probably the most misquoted line in Metro Detroit might be that 8 Mile line. Like, everybody hit 8 Mile, because that isn't what he said at all, but it burned in people's minds. And personally, I think that's because that's what they wanted to hear around Coleman Young.
Well, I think it's a great point. I think it's not only what, unfortunately, some people wanted to hear, but I think that major media outlets played on the sensational thoughts of people in hopes of selling more newspapers and attracting more viewers. To the point about the cards that Coleman Young was dealt. People forget. In 1950, the U.S. Census said Detroit had 1.8 million residents, nearly 1.9 million residents. When Coleman Young took office, it was about 1.5. Why is that important? Well, I guess it's important because nearly 300,000 people had left Detroit between the time Mayor Cobo was sworn in January of 1950 and the time that Coleman Young was sworn in 1974. Coleman Young had a very different economy than Mayor Cobo had. Detroit had suffered a mass exodus, not only of residents, but of commercial business, which obviously in both cases had a negative effect on tax revenue, the money with which to hire police officers to cut grass at parks and to do other quality of life things. Coleman Young was challenged in that regard, but really the ball got rolling in terms of the exodus from the city proper. That ball got rolling right after the Detroit riot of 1943, and certainly by 1946, 7, and 48. And so by the time Mayor Cobo came, Detroit had topped out in population, but the 7 years he was mayor lost population. And in fact, if you go back and look at newspaper accounts of the years like 1955, 1956, and 1957, Detroit was in a recession. And it's interesting, we've even had a U.S. president in Donald Trump say during his campaign in 2016 that Democrats presided over, Detroit's demise. Well, interestingly enough, two Republican mayors, Cobo and Mariani, really presided over a city that was shrinking significantly by the month and by the year, and certainly their policies would have had to have something to do with that.
you didn't mention it, but I think it's something that might be interesting, or I think is important to talk about, is that when Coleman Young took office, you had things that to a lot of suburbanites and white suburbanites aren't part of our cultural history or part of our cultural memory. But if you do the research, you see things like stress. You see things like very terrible policing and discriminatory housing practices that the Black community dealt with, that Coleman Young made a large impact in those early years.
There's no doubt about that. If you look at the police community relations in the 1950s and 1960s under Cobo, Mariani, and quite frankly, while it got better at times, you still would have to say under Mayors Kavanaugh and Gribbs, police community relations were really challenged, and that's not only in Black communities but in white communities as well. The stress unit, the notorious and controversial police decoy unit was not started by Mayor Young. It was started by Mayor Gribbs and his police commissioner at the time, John Nichols. In the early 1970 or 71, and a disproportionate number of African Americans were fatally shot during some of those decoy opportunities. But even before stress, the notorious Big Four, which was classically four white police officers in a sedan driving through African American communities and at times terrorizing African American men, a lot of them young men. Those tactics were carried out by Mayors Cobo, Mariani, and still until the 1960s, Mayor Kavanaugh. Mayor Kavanaugh refused to implement a civilian police commission to help oversee the police department. That was a revolutionary change that was brought by Mayor Coleman Young, and it still exists today. And other communities across the country have patterned similar oversight committees made up of, in part or in whole, by civilians that watch over police policies and the like. And so, very difficult hand that Mayor Young was dealt when he took office in January of 1974. But it's very clear, the seeds for Detroit's demise in that regard were really planted by mayors Jeffries, Cobo, Mariani, and while it got better at times, Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find all your things?
Well, I keep a very active social media presence, both on Facebook and Twitter. I post every day history of Detroit, particularly as it relates to African Americans, on Facebook. You can find me there at simply Ken Coleman. On Twitter, you can find me, and my handle is History Lives DET.
Today's episode is brought to you in part by Milo Digital. Milo Digital is a full-service digital marketing agency that engineers quality results through data and innovative strategies. Learn more at milodetroit.com.
Here are a couple other things you should know going on around town. Ponyride, the nonprofit small business incubator, has sold its Corktown building and plans to relocate to the nearby Core City neighborhood. The Detroit News reports that Ponyride sold its 30,000 square foot building on Vermont Street for $3.3 million to a local developer who plans to charge market rents for the space. Local entrepreneur Phil Cooley launched Ponyride in 2011 when he bought the building out of foreclosure for $100,000. It offers low-cost rent to aspiring artists, entrepreneurs, and others. The new location will be on Lorraine Street, which is near Grand River and I-94. Ponyride officials say they don't yet know whether it will be a temporary or permanent location.
Also, a new study of urban real estate says home prices in Detroit rose a whopping 97% over 5 years, the largest jump of any city in North America. But the report from Canadian real estate search and news portal Point2 Homes notes that Detroit is something of an outlier among the 83 cities profiled. The net increase in home prices in Detroit translates to just over $30,000 to $61,000, a relative bargain. For comparison, the Vancouver suburb of Surrey came in second. It saw an 88% increase in net home prices, to the U.S. equivalent of around $640,000. San Francisco was third, with a 69% increase to more than $1.3 million. The analysis says Detroit's increase was due in part to a shrinking inventory and steady demand. Overall, it found that housing prices have increased far more than personal incomes in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
That'll do it for today's show, friends. Thanks so much for listening. Like what you're hearing? Tell a friend about Daily Detroit. Or become part of the show by becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/dailydetroit. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.